A very good afternoon to everybody. I hope you can hear me. I'm the session chair for the fourth session that is titled Laws, Policies and Regulations, International Tax Treaties. The title may suggest that we're looking at international tax treaties, but I shall already tell you that the panel discussion here involves not just discussion of international tax treaties, but also a very closely linked issue of investment and trade law. It is my pleasure to introduce our panel today. We have an esteemed guest speaker list here because I have a mix of practitioners and academicians from tax law, but also from investment and trade law. What is it we are seeking to do in this session? The session is for a total of 75 minutes from 1 p.m. to 15 p.m. Indian Standard Time. And what we have thought about is to structure as a free flowing discussion. We start with certain general questions so that our specialist and non specialist audience can both find interest and access to the subject matter being spoken about. We then move to a very interesting, controversial issue that has been written about in the media for several years now. So even if you are a non-specialist, you've heard about the phrases tax terrorism, you've heard about retrospective or retroactive taxation, or as media would call it, Vodafone saga. So what are these issues? Why are they relevant? And of course, what we are doing today in the theme of the entire conclave itself is to look at the reforms since 1991. So the focus of this session is to look at reforms and to look specifically at tax law, but of course to also look at investment and trade law nexus to tax law. So without much more ado, I would like to introduce our speakers. We have three speakers and it's a pleasure to introduce them. The first speaker is Dr. Suranjali Tandon. She's an assistant professor at National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, New Delhi. She writes extensively on international tax law. Her specific areas of interest are international taxation, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals that are being debated at a global level. She's really involved in talking about these issues. You see her writings popular media, but also in academic journals. She's also looking at green finance and financial markets. Welcome, Dr. Tandon. I will then use the second speaker, Ms. Pratibha Jain. Pratibha Jain is Group General Counsel and a member of the Management Committee at Everstone. She also oversees public policy and corporate affairs of the group, apart from handling the legal matters. Before joining Everstone, Pratibha was a partner at Nisha Desai Associates, which is a boutique popular tax law firm in India and abroad. She has led their M&A and private equity practice. So we have a very interesting lens coming from her decades of experience in international and Indian work that she's been involved with, not just with Nishit Desai and Everstone, but also with firms abroad, Sullivan Cromwell, and also Goldman Sachs. Pratibha is in fact a Master's of Law graduate from University of Harvard, a Bachelor of Civil Laws graduate from University of Oxford, and a Bachelor of Laws graduate from University of Delhi. So we have someone who has world-class experience, and we are very grateful to have you as well. Our third speaker is Dr. Prabhash Ranjan. Professor Dr. Prabhash Ranjan is a prolific writer again on international investment law and trade law. He is working currently as professor at the Jindal Global Law School. Prior to this, he has held academic positions at South Asian University, which is an international university established by SAARC countries. He's also worked as associate professor at different national law schools prior to this, National Law University, Jodhpur, and National University of Juridical Sciences, Calcutta. He has been a visiting scholar at Brookings, India, and a visiting fellow at the Lauter Pact Center for International Law at University of Cambridge. He's been closely involved with also working for the government and advising the government, including in relation to the drafting of the 260th Commission, Law Commission report on the bilateral investment treaty model. He's now recently also been invited on the Parliamentary Committee on External Affairs to depose as an expert witness on India and its bilateral investment treaties. So I would like to kick off the discussion with, as I said, a more general question for our speakers. The first thing I want us to tell our audience is about what are the various international agreements that touch upon tax and that India has entered into, particularly since 1991. What is that they achieved for the Indian economy? Would you attribute some of the role of the expansion of the Indian economy in the last 3 decades to these treaties? So I would like to begin by talking about the tax treaties and then move to the investment treaties. So for this reason, it would be nice if Pratibha starts and then Suranjali follows up on this question. You may have to unmute yourselves.
Yes, hi Ashashita. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me here today. So I think from a tax treaty perspective, we've always had the global trade agreements, we've had the bilateral investment treaties. And we've been very actively, as everyone knows, negotiating with the international community, especially the developed countries, on OECD, which is going to be very, very important for how global tax pans out, especially in respect to developing countries. I think India has taken a lead in terms of negotiations at the OECD, which we all should be proud of. But I think importantly to the question on what tax treaties we have is what has been our approach towards international tax and tax treaties. I think the lens has always been on getting more revenues and more tax revenues rather than the overall investment environment that creates. Especially for attracting investments into India. And there's been many number of times where India could have been at the forefront of getting foreign investment compared to economies you get compared to China, Korea, other developing Asian economies. And sometimes we miss the bigger picture when we are doing these negotiations and even reworking of the BITs, which I assume that Professor Arjun will talk about. If from the private investment point of view, and whenever I talk to investors globally, the tax uncertainty that India brings to the discussion, and a very hard stance sometimes, and unilateral measures like equalization levy, which makes India stand out, have hampered the view that investors take of the economy. And in any deal negotiations, tax becomes the key issue for negotiations because the tax uncertainty, whether with respect to enforcement of the tax treaties, even the double taxation avoidance treaties, and the amendments that we made there, and it took a number of years of pain. Now, thankfully, they're very settled. But during that period when the double taxation treaties, avoidance tax treaties, were being opened up and amounts were being negotiated with Mauritius, Singapore, the effect, the chilling effect on investment was very evident to us because we are at the forefront of these investments, and then the government will see it after a year or two, and then thankfully we now gotten to a more stable regime there. So important thing in all these negotiations and all, entering into these global treaties is keeping the overall investment environment in mind.
Suranjali, if you can also add to that, do you also think that the driver for these agreements is investment? Because there is academic literature that says both arguments, that we believe that it is investment, but it may not really be. So, what is your take as an economist working in international tax law?
Thanks, Ashita. I think you hit the nail on the head because this is the question that experts keep asking each other on, what a particular treaty is supposed to do for an economy. And I want to break it down into two parts, and I know that, Bhash will talk about bilateral investment treaties, and I don't want to take
more on that. But just to clarify that, the bilateral investment treaties were being signed to promote investments in developing countries. And the tax treaties were signed to allocate taxing rights between countries. And in a sense, that purpose has gotten hazy over time. We begin to think as if tax treaties were supposed to bring in investment. Even if at the moment we see that there are preferential and there's certainty to be given to the taxpayer through the tax treaty, does it really impact investments? It's a big question mark in the debate. In fact, even today there is no consensus. The IMF and the World Bank cannot tell this is a hard line and it has a positive impact on investments. Interestingly, I have some thought experimentation in numbers with tax, with investment inflows and changes in tax treaties and bilateral investments. And I actually found that after the Vodafone and Cambridge dispute, foreign direct investment was not as visible. I'm willing to take my head out on that one. But if you look at back the numbers, it wasn't really adversely affected. So in a sense, it's all about how much a country is willing to forego in terms of what it hands out to foreign investments and how it perceives its own domestic investors. And I think India is trying to strike that balance. There are approaches which also look like exceptions to the rule, for example, the equalization levy, which are looked at adversely, and there are economic reasons for that as well. For example, double taxation. But the question is that tax is not third quarters. So if you not use an approach which is, for the lack of word normal, you cannot catch the gist. And I think where we are going today on the inclusive framework, where market jurisdictions now have a way to regulate tax, is actually a function of us pushing ahead our proposals to say we're adding more revenues and maybe counters will fall in line. So if we go back to Adam Smith's way of thinking, establishing neutrality in taxation between your domestic taxpayers and foreign taxpayers requires some tiptoeing around the international agreements and fixing the inequalities, I would say, in the legal framework to restore the level playing field. So I'm just going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. If time permits, maybe I come back to the equalization levy issue. But I would like to now ask Prabhash for his views on, so where do you see the link between tax and investment? As Suranjali says, bilateral investment treaties are premised on bringing in more investment. So if that is your view, then what do you say about the tax investment link? Why is that so important? Is it something that we have observed more recently after the Vodafone came kind of disputes going into investment treaty arbitration, or is it something that may have already been there? That's something I think our audience find interesting. Over to you, Prabhash.
Yeah, thank you, Ashrita. I'm extremely grateful to the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and it's wonderful to be part of this panel. I think the link between tax and investment arises because of bilateral investment treaties, which give investors the power to challenge sovereign regulatory measures of states before investment treaty arbitration tribunals. So, because of the ISDS provision, the investor state dispute settlement provision, which is undoubtedly the most unique aspect of international investment law, and since foreign investors have this ability to directly challenge sovereign regulatory measures, if there is a taxation measure which hurts their interest, right, and even if this taxation measure has been adopted or implemented by the relevant host state following its general regulatory measures, even then the foreign investor can challenge it as a potential breach of its investment treaty rights. And this gives an opportunity to the investor state dispute settlement tribunal to then adjudicate upon the taxation measures. So the link between tax and investment, in my view, comes in because of this feature of investment treaties. It is also true that at least the first generation investment treaties, that is the treaties that were signed in 1990s or early 2000s or even in 1980s, did not exclude taxation measures from the purview of investment treaties. So as a result, if you have not excluded taxation measures, then taxation measures are just like any other regulatory measure which can be challenged, and this is precisely what foreign investors have done. In context of India, this started with Vodafone, but if we look at it globally, it has been happening for quite some time. I mean, if we go back to the days of Occidental exploration versus Ecuador and several other cases that American and European investors have brought, and even if we look at cases under the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, there are several cases which foreign investors have brought where they have challenged the taxation measures of the state as a breach of either the Energy Charter Treaty or the relevant bilateral investment treaty. So it is because of this that there is a what scholars call as a normative dialogue between international tax law on the one hand and international investment law on the other hand. And this is only going to increase in my view in the future, unless or until the treaty negotiators or the countries who are negotiating these treaties want to keep tax and investment completely sort of separate from each other. We see trends towards this, and maybe we can talk about this, later in the panel. But if there is no such demarcation, then there's nothing that stops a foreign investor from drawing the link between investment and taxation. And it's a fact that the taxation policies or the taxation stand of the country is obviously a very important factor that foreign investors take into account before they decide to invest or not invest. I agree with Suranjali that whether there is a link between investment treaties and foreign investment inflows, well, that jury is still out. Perhaps we will require a separate panel to discuss or debate on that. In India, there is some evidence to suggest that yes, there is a link between the two. But yeah, one can always argue that, as she rightly said, that despite the Vodafone and Team cases, foreign investment in India hasn't stopped or hasn't been adversely impacted. So I'll stop here and then we can take this conversation forward.
Thank you very much. And I think one question to kind of retrace back for our audience would be that if we think about Vodafone and Kane, there is a refuge, as we say, to the bilateral investment treaties. So why is it that there is refuge to the bilateral investment treaties, but not to the tax treaties? Our speaker already first told us about the fact that we have an extensive network of tax treaties. We have India with 94 tax treaties. So was it that they did not have a tax treaty, or what was the disadvantage under the tax treaty? Either of Pratibha and Suranjali, if you'd like to just deconstruct that so that our audience sees what the comparative value of the investment treaty versus the tax treaty dispute resolution opportunities are like. Maybe Suranjali will start and then Pratibha can come in.
Happy to let Pratibha start. I mean, go ahead, Pratibha. I'll continue.
Okay, sure. So the bilateral tax treaties, really the double tax avoidance tax treaties, which were not suitable for or did not have the provisions that BIT, as Professor Ranjan mentioned, the bilateral investment treaties that we have with most of the investments had come either through Mauritius or Singapore, mostly through Mauritius at that time. And the Mauritius-India tax treaty is very robust in terms of dispute resolution mechanisms. And the interpretation of State Act included in international jurisprudence, which is well developed compared to your double tax avoidance treaties. So for including your tax authorities, including your courts, right? So in one case it was the tax department, in the other case it was Supreme Court for non-tax matters like coal. But that just the international jurisprudence on BITs really helped the companies that went against the Indian government. And I think that is why the trigger to renegotiate the bilateral investment treaties, which the government now has which seems like Dr. Ranjan was part of the committee to renege the existing contracts, and when they come up for renewal, have a more limited bilateral investment treaty, which does not cover some of the issues where India is getting hit. And India got hit really bad. I think at some point we had like 17 BITs against India, and the amounts have been huge. And we don't have a mechanism necessarily to settle these disputes. Our system is set up and gives incentive for the bureaucrats to keep fighting rather than settle these disputes, which is even called 80% of the cases India would lose these BITs, and yet we are not settling. It's a combination of all of this that gives an incentive to the companies to go under BIT rather than, any other mechanism.
Thank you, Pratibha. Suranjali, what would you add?
Yeah, so Ashita, you asked a very fundamental question. Now, if there are two different treaties which are sort of have an overlap, why is it the BIT was removed? And I think anyone new to the subject should understand that in the particular case, let's say Kane, the UK-India tax treaty allowed capital gains to be taxed as per Indian law. And that basically means that it was not a violation of the Indian double tax treaty. Now, having been when first there would have been another process of dispute resolution, which means from IT to the House of Revenue on into the MAP process, with very, very competent authorities which are government officials sit on the table and negotiate juncture. But on the other hand, what happened is that since it was applicable, the domestic law was applicable, the taxpayer figured out that there is another way to bring direct action against state. And this is something which is being talked about greatly by experts on how BITs, in fact, have a superior method, if you want to call it superior, method of dispute resolution where a taxpayer can bring a claim against the state directly. And it makes me wonder if this would become a preferred method, as Julian Chase also points out that this would become a preferred method of dispute resolution, because you do not have to go through the process of dealing with competent authorities and have to wait for one of their decisions to win. So I think that's the broad structure of why BITs are, or in this particular case, why BIT was invoked, and in the future, maybe invoked rather than the double tax avoidance agreement.
Thank you, Suranjali. And I think we may circle back to generally dispute resolution in the future for it, and also investment treaty and the future for it towards the end of the session. But I would just like to bring Pratibha and you back for one specific question before we delve deeper into Vodafone and Kane, which is, of course, we've seen a rapid expansion of the Indian economy. And as we've already established to some extent, taxation is not devoid of the politics. Investment, politics, trade, tax, these all somehow kind of come together, especially when we talk about global negotiations. And global negotiations are particularly underway today about what we are talking about, which is the digital economy conundrum. How to tax these digital economy companies that really don't need a physical place of business, and that in fact benefit to a great extent because of the market jurisdiction that countries like India supply. So just quick thoughts on the rise of India within the global tax negotiation table, right? We have been but just an outsider for several years, if you look at the beginning of the 90s. But now we are somehow driving this quite at the helm of certain global discussion forums. So what is your take on that? Do you think India is doing well enough? Do you think we could have done better? Both unilateral measures as well as global multilateral discussions. Just few short comments on this, then we go back into the Vodafone and Kane dispute.
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
I think the fact that India was leading 132 other countries in terms of the discussions at OECD for how, especially the digital economy taxation, is definitely a matter of certain degree of pride. And the solution that is emerging in terms of amending profit allocation and nexus rules and expanding the taxation rates of countries where businesses operate. That I think will provide countries like India a much wider tax net than what is happening today, because most of these companies, global MNCs, especially the digital ones, are based in countries like Ireland, which may not even have a corporate tax. And India doesn't get to tax them. And I think there's also a global minimum rate of 15% that's proposed. So all of that is great if you can have a speedy consensus and put it in place. So in the meantime, like I had briefly touched on equalization levy, that's a unilateral measure that, others are now also looking to emulate. What that does is create the tax uncertainty that spooks businesses. In fact, the Revenue Secretary, Mr. Varun Bajaj himself had said that, in a country which has a budget of more than 30 lakh crore, an amount of 5,000 to 10,000 crore is not that important. And India's collected about 2,000 crores in the last financial year through equalization levy. So if you then, and to the point that Ranjani made earlier, that FDIs have not been impacted, I don't agree. You might not see a decrease in FDI, but that does not mean that India has reached its potential. In fact, far from it. From where we see as India's potential, from where we see the talent in India, the startup talent in India, and we see them struggling to get the kind of funding. Right now, markets are hot, but talk about the last 3 years. It really impacts global investment climate in terms of, especially for venture capital money to come in. Venture capital money is very fickle compared to private equity, and where we've seen maximum investment is in the infrastructure sector. So, when you start breaking that analysis down to potential versus, okay, the number is positive or, 10% or 20% higher compared to China's growth in the same period where they liberalized and where we liberalized, and our potential, I think it definitely has a chilling effect. And we should really think about these unilateral measures and think about our global negotiations from an overall investment climate perspective. Very quickly, I was looking at the US state government website, and it actually mentions all these issues. India reneging on its broader BITs covering tax, the equalization levy, all of this has been mentioned. So something to really think about.
So Ranjali, so what would you say? The revenue gain from equalization levy, it has been put out, even I saw that it may be around 2,000 crores per year. So would you say that maybe the revenue gain is or is not too much, but it is more about the posturing and the win we've had to some extent at pushing the agenda for market jurisdictions at a global level? What would your take be?
Yeah, in fact, Ashita, I have sort of a contrarian view, and maybe it's wrong, but what I generally believe is that the 2,000 crore that you look at is just an optic in terms of equalization levy itself. Now, equalization levy is not a tax which is just supposed to get revenue. It also changes corporate tax behavior. So if a company today were to restructure, those gains you will see in corporate tax collections, but you won't see that in equalization levy. And which is in part, some companies have done this. They've done the reorganization to sort of suit so that they don't have to pay these two taxes in two jurisdictions. So I'd say that it's very important, and countries like France, for example, or Italy have also sort of said that they want to apply these taxes to be able to talk to US on an even keel, because so far we've heard about inclusive framework and the word of equal footing, but it was really norms, or this was just sort of hinting to countries that we sit equally on the table, but it doesn't happen until you nudge them enough with measures such as India has taken. I want to step back and also say that, I am aware that my claim that FDI flows were not affected at all brings a lot of anger, because it's contrary to practitioners what they've seen on the ground. But I want to just clarify, when I say that from potential. I don't say that from just the rate of growth. So, for example, if you look at global growth and predict backwards, and I don't want to go into the econometrics of it because the listeners will sort of zone out. But looking at the potential global growth and India's growth, and then if you predict backwards FDI, the forecasts are actually in line with what we received actually. So that speaks a lot volumes on what these policies or what India can do in terms of policy. And just quickly to say that India did gain its importance in the inclusive framework, not because it had lots to disagree on, but because it's one of the most important market jurisdictions. It accounts for 12% of global buyers. It accounts for 12% of global digital users. It's 3% of global consumption. So if technology companies want to make their way into India, then they have to at least listen to what India has to say on tax policy. So I would say it's economics which has sort of played into the political power as well when they talk within the inclusive framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think these are oft debated topics and we may not really find answers in this panel. But I want to now bring in Prabhash for his expertise on investment and trade law. So, Prabhash, my question to you is, when we think and hear about these Vodafone and Kane disputes, even if we are non-specialists in the audience, we've definitely heard the phrases Vodafone saga and tax terrorism. We've heard retrospective as well as retroactive taxation. So maybe if you can get us started by telling us what this is all about, and in your view, is it really retrospective or retroactive taxation? Are these terms that can be used interchangeably, or are they really different terms with a completely different scope? Over to you, Prabhash.
Yeah, Ashwita, that's a very good question, because at least in the discourse that we have in India, the words retroactive and retrospective are often used interchangeably. But legally speaking, both these terms have a different meaning. So when we say a retroactive legal provision, it basically means a provision that changes the past legal consequences of facts that occurred before the provision was officially enacted or published or announced. Whereas when we talk of a retrospective statute, it operates forward, but it looks backwards. In that, what I mean by this is that it attaches new consequences for the future to an event that took place before the statute was enacted. Now, if you convert this understanding or apply this understanding in context of tax legislation, and if you look at the work of tax lawyers like Philip Baker, for example, he argues that a retroactive tax legislation refers to a legislation whereby a tax burden or a higher tax burden is imposed on income which has already been earned. So in other words, it covers those situations where the law imposed no or lower tax burden when the income was earned, and the retroactive legislation has then changed this to impose a new or a higher tax burden. Now, this can be contrasted with retrospective tax legislation, whereby a tax burden, including a higher burden, is imposed on future income arising from a transaction that has already been completed. So if we look at this difference between retroactive and retrospective, and where do we categorize the Indian tax amendment or the tax amendment that was brought in 2012, it was a case of retroactive tax legislation, not retrospective tax legislation, because when the Vodafone transaction took place, or when the Kane transaction took place in 2006, the law, at least it was settled by the Supreme Court in the Vodafone case, that such offshore transactions are not taxable in India. So there was no tax burden on such offshore transactions. Now, whether the Supreme Court was right in interpreting the law or wrong in interpreting the law, that's a matter of debate. But the Supreme Court interpreted the law in one way, and as per that interpretation, such offshore transactions were not taxable. Now, what India did in 2012 was to bring a law saying that such offshore transactions on which there was no tax to be imposed are taxed, right? So it in a way created a retroactive tax obligation on the claimants. I mean, Vodafone and Kane in this case. So it's important. The reason I'm making this point is because it's important to understand that retroactive and retrospective tax measures have different meanings, and we can deconstruct or we can understand where India went wrong vis-a-vis its investment treaty obligations only when we first understand what was the nature of the measure. And the Kane Energy Tribunal actually went into detail into this, and it sort of clarified this issue that the Indian tax measure was a retroactive tax measure, which created a fresh obligation on a transaction which was not taxed earlier, on which there was a zero tax earlier. And this, as we know, was challenged by foreign investors, resulting into two adverse arbitral awards.
Thank you very much, Prakash. I think this brings the topic quite close to even a non-specialist. What we gather, therefore, is that there was a lot of back and forth. We see that the Supreme Court decided one way, but the government went the other way with its amendments through the legislative process. But a short question before we kind of recap what this did for us again is, what is the current status now? Because as you said, there were adverse, vis-a-vis the investors, they won at the tribunals abroad through the investment treaty arbitrations, but there were also news reports about the government now backing off or seeking to withdraw these retroactive amendments. So where are we standing right now before we kind of take a reflection of the last few decades of disputes?
Yeah, so the government, I mean, the law has now been changed. An amendment was brought a few months back. This should have been done long back. I expected this to happen as soon as the new government came to office in 2014, but it didn't happen. But it has happened now. And now the law, as it states, is that for all the transactions that took place before 2012, the retroactive provision will not apply. So the provision, the law which will tax offshore transactions, that remains on the statute book, but it will apply prospectively. It will not apply retroactively. And this is precisely what India should have done, in my view, even after losing the Vodafone case. In 2012 itself, it could have said that, okay, fine, in our belief, such transactions should be taxed in India. If the law was not clear, then we will clarify it and we will say that such transactions will be taxed henceforth. Interestingly, I don't know if people know about this, but before the Kane Energy Tribunal, India kept on arguing that this is not a retroactive tax legislation. It is a clarificatory measure, which obviously the tribunal did not accept. It said that you may give it any label or any name. The fact of the matter is that you have imposed a tax obligation retroactively. So it is not merely clarificatory in nature. So the law as it stands today, it is prospective in nature. We can also debate on why India brought this change. If everything was going on fine, then maybe there was no need for India to make this change. But I guess, I'm not an economist, so I will not get into the economy, because I don't understand the econometrics behind this, that how it has impacted FDI inflows, etc. But I think as an observer, it is very clearly evident that India was attracting a lot of bad press because of both these cases internationally. These were not cases of the kind that we have seen in investment treaty, where the foreign investor is challenging a genuine regulatory measure of the state. In my book, I argue that India hasn't seen a Philip Morris movement yet. So it was not a situation that you enacted a genuine public health regulatory measure, which a tobacco company challenged because its profits were hurt. These cases arose because you did not, when I say you, it means the government, did not want to honor the decision of its own Supreme Court, right? So that was a very important factor. Now, the government, when it has changed the law, it continues to say that we are not doing this because we have lost the two cases before international arbitration tribunals. That's a very, very important point. They are presenting this as a domestic tax reform. They're presenting this as yet another example of undoing a mistake that was made by a previous government, right? So it's more like a domestic tax reform story, tax reform narrative. not because India lost the two cases. And I guess this is the reason why the new law says that we'll only repay the principal, will not repay the interest. Whereas the income tax law on this point is very clear that if you have collected a tax wrongly, then you have to repay the principal along with the interest, right? But there's an exception to that particular rule in this amendment, which says that we'll repay only the principal, and that is to ensure that we are not doing this to comply with the adverse arbitral awards, but more as a tax reform measure. So India's stand continues to be that taxation is a sovereign policy measure, and investment treaty arbitration tribunals have no business to adjudicate on that. But as I have written, that in my view is not a correct stand, at least in international law. Taxation measures are indeed sovereign measures, but that doesn't mean that they can't be challenged or they can't be adjudicated upon by arbitration tribunals.
Very, very interesting. I just want to ask Suranjali one question before we reflect together on Vodafone and Kane. So when the withdrawal was kind of announced, there were also terms and conditions attached to this about what Vodafone and Kane would have to do in terms of claiming that they will never come back on this dispute again. And I think you wrote about this as being also negatively perceived by some companies and investors. Just short reflections on this would be helpful, Suranjali.
Yeah, Ashita. So, in fact, if you look at the detailed guidelines on what the taxpayer is supposed to do once they withdraw this particular dispute, they have to withdraw all their claims of elsewhere. It involves even withdrawing claims in the future that may arise, pertaining to this, which to me is a very vaguely worded, legislation. It basically shows the fears that the government currently has that when it settles, is the matter going to be put to rest, or there can be liabilities in the future with regard to this. So it could be that the taxpayer may not be able to preempt what the future implications are. And you're seeing that, instantly there was a response from Kane and Vodafone, which was a little cautiously worded, but it's sort of suggested that they might be willing to settle, but we still haven't seen where it's landed. So we have to wait and watch.
Exactly. So while we wait and watch, we also use this panel to, I think, bring back all of you to reflect on the discussion we began with, to say, yes, we have mixed opinions on whether this has impacted foreign investment inflows, but also I want to bring you back, Pratibha, first to say, you said there is an impact on business, which you are seeing. You're the helm of private equity and venture capital investment advisory. So, what is it that you see as the negative adverse impact, and also what is it that you think these kinds of measures being taken tell investors abroad about the tax system of the country? I think you mentioned uncertainty in the past, so I want to bring you back for that.
Thanks, Ashita. Actually, again, I'm not an economist, but we see on a daily basis, we struggle to get investments into the country. We see the potential. We see both startups and well-established businesses needing more funding. Right now, the markets are hot, but that's a very new phenomenon. So you're seeing a lot of listings. But when your listing is not an option, getting foreign investment is the only hope, because banks are not lending and banks are not providing funding. In lack of having a robust debt market in India, your foreign investment is the only recourse for a lot of startups not going under. And I would like to check the assumptions used to say we've reached our FDI potential, because from where I sit as an investor, we definitely see an amazing potential in the country, which is completely untapped. And it does not, like nothing other than, quite honestly, the policies that we have, the red tape that we have, the bureaucracy that we have, including on the tax side, having a very narrow revenue-based approach for the tax department rather than an investment-based approach, which a country like India, you cannot compare yourself to Italy or rest of Europe. They are importer of services. We want to be an exporter of services. So when you introduce equalization levy or unilateral tax measures, it inhibits the growth of your startups that are trying to export services. We have a young population unlike any other country. And how do you meet the potential of that young economy unless you are creating and thinking of a global system that encourages and reduces the cost of doing business for them internationally? So how do I reduce export costs? How do I reduce taxes for them when they go to other countries? So obviously, if you're going to tax US businesses, they're going to tax you back. We have trade sanctions from US right now, where we want to be a major partner. So unless we come with a mindset that looks at growth and not a narrow revenue from taxes, which actually you will have to pay penalty possibly because you're imposing taxes that won't withstand the scrutiny, like Professor Ranjan said, in international taxation provisions. You are wasting your time, chasing your tail rather than, and what I would really like to see the government to do, and I must give credit to this government. I've now been dealing with 4 consecutive governments on the Ministry of Finance side. I think this government's most forward-looking. But some of the bureaucratic baggage that we've had, the red tape we've had, is holding us back. And unless we create a committee for growth, like all the ministries come together and say, any policy that we come out needs to be tested against how is this inhibiting growth for the country. Unless it passes that muster, especially the tax department should not be allowed to do anything.
Thank you, Pratibha. I think lots to think about for sure. I want to bring in Prabhash just to kind of reflect on what has this meant for the bilateral investment treaty network, because we all know that there were certain measures taken by the Indian government on trying to terminate its bilateral investment treaties because possibly of the fear of the exposure due to such similar disputes like Vodafone and Kane. So what do you see as the impact on the bilateral investment treaty network caused maybe directly out of the disputes that India has had to field flowing out of Vodafone and Kane?
Yeah, Ashrita, sure. But before I answer that, I'll say that I agree with Ms. Jain. The approach that India follows is what can be called as a penny wise, pound foolish kind of approach. And that was evident in both Vodafone and Kane. Just to collect some amount of tax, you kind of inflicted a lot of damage on the India story, as it is called. Before I answer your specific question on the BIT termination, I think it's important, there's one very fine point about the Kane Energy Tribunal and its ruling on tax, which is important for listeners to understand. The tribunal did not say that India breached its BIT obligations just because it enacted a retroactive tax legislation. So retroactive tax legislation per se does not mean breach of the investment treaty, at least going by the reasoning of the Kane Energy Tribunal. And this is a very interesting and a very important contribution to the investment law jurisprudence, because so far the scholarly work has said that if there is a retroactive change in the legal regime, that on its own might lead to breach of the investment treaty, specifically of the fair and equitable treatment provision. But the Kane Energy Tribunal said that even a retroactive legislation would be okay, as long as there is a very significant public policy purpose that justifies the application of the law retroactively. So the tribunal said that if India could show that there is a very strong public policy justification for the retroactive taxation, then that might pass the test and it would not be a breach of the fair and equitable treatment provision, or specifically of the principle of legal certainty. But India failed to sort of provide the specific public policy justification. So, for example, India said that we have brought in this retroactive taxation because we want to combat, the systemic tax abuse by foreign corporations. But the tribunal did not agree with this because they said that India failed to show that there was any such systemic abuse which they were trying to counter. Again, India tried to justify this, by saying that foreign corporations use tax havens as a place for investment, and to counter that practice, we are bringing this retroactive tax legislation. But again, that evil, if at all, could be tackled through prospective legislation. So the point that I'm trying to make is that even a retroactive legislation would be okay, provided you have a very strong public policy justification. So for the policymakers, the offshoot of this is that if indeed you have, for some reason want to change a law retroactively, please make a very strong case for what is the public policy justification behind that. Otherwise, it might be struck down by the arbitration tribunal. On the specific question of BIT termination, in my view, this has been a case of overreaction by India. India's approach suddenly has become very, very defensive because of all these arbitration cases that have come up against India, not just taxation measures, but also other measures. And as a result of which, India has unilaterally terminated almost all of its investment treaties. It has tried to, or it is trying to negotiate new investment treaties with newer countries based on the model that it adopted in 2016. But several countries, or at least those countries which are keen to export capital to India, such as US, European Union, etc., they have several apprehensions about the Indian model bit. So whether India will be able to convince these treaty partners to enter into investment treaty is something that we'll have to wait and see. But on the face of it, I don't think that's going to happen unless or until India, is flexible to change some of the provisions that it has in its model BIT, which may not be acceptable to the other countries. So India's decision to review its investment treaties in light of these disputes was a welcome decision. But India's reaction, in my view, has been overboard. And unfortunately, the mindset that I think prevails within the government is that we want to completely immunize ourselves from investment treaty claims. That, in my view, is a very narrow way, or a very sort of short-term way to look at things, which a country like India should not do.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, and talking again about short-term versus long-term perspectives. So, Ranjali, what was your reflection on all of this? I'm going to bring in a few themes. Firstly, reflections from a tax policy perspective, reputational costs that has somehow been, I think, touched upon by all of you, but also what does it mean for taxpayers, for small and large taxpayers? Maybe I can bring in Pratibha and Prabhash again on this, but first I'd like to hear from you, Suranjali.
Thanks, Ashita. And I think this is a valid question when you say small taxpayers, and this is something I've been talking about for a long time. I know that this case got bad press, but all publicity is good publicity. No, moving away from the joke, I would say that, we think about the entire issue on investments and taxation from a large taxpayer's point of view. And that's sort of setting the narrative elsewhere. If you look at FDI, it's less than 6% of your GDP. So what we're saying is that we must worry about 6% of the GDP and not worry about everything else as much. Now, if you look in terms of equality is one of the ways, or equity, which is where tax policy is at now. The entire normative setting of international tax policy has changed. It's no longer what it was a century ago, as we keep saying. And it seems like equity and justice are a part of it. Now, if you look at this particular amendment from that perspective, fine enough, the revenues are small, but they are equivalent of your entire securities transaction tax collection. So what you're saying is that the infirmities in law must not be fixed at the expense of two taxpayers vis-a-vis a large set of taxpayers that exist everywhere else. I mean, of course, it's a very controversial view to have, But that's the lens I look at tax policy and this amendment, because there's a bigger picture there. And something that I've been reflecting back, and perhaps Prabhash will talk about it more in detail because he's an expert at this. But the standards of customary international law, I know that the bilateral investment treaties have moved away from customary international law, but the FET really goes back to CIL. And they have been vague for the longest time. So a lot of academicians contest the application of FET and the morphing of expropriation to indirect expropriation as a dated concept. And what we're doing is we're applying a dated concept to an updated concept of tax. And how do you sort of resolve that conflict? Is it that the investment agreements should have been brought to date with the new thinking on taxes, rather than us saying that the taxes should have been evaluated on an outdated thinking on investment agreements? So, I mean, I think I just stopped there because of paucity of time, but those are my few thoughts.
Thank you very much.
And I just quickly mention, just quickly checked. China investments is 43% of the GDP. So that just shows you what India is missing out on. And when you talk about the small taxpayer, I'm also talking about small businesses. I'm talking about growth. I'm talking about employment. I'm talking about taking people out of the poverty line, everything, and not just, that narrow tax bracket.
Thank you, Pratibha. I would just like to tell all the audience listening to our panel discussion, we could reserve a few minutes towards the end of the session. We are about 18 minutes to wrap up the session. So if you have questions, please do leave it on the YouTube link or on the chat box function. We will be intimated about it, and I can then allocate last few minutes to ask our speakers anything that comes directly from you. But just one more collective question. Going forward then, recapping since 1991 and looking at one of the most controversial tax investment trade related issues that we hope is somewhat close to resolution, but we're still waiting as we speak. What are our collective reflections on going forward? So Prabhash, maybe you get us started with what you think about investment treaty and tax link. Is that really going away with the so-called new model BIT, trying to exclude tax matters? What would your thoughts on this be?
Yeah, sure. But before I answer that, I'll just like to very respectfully disagree with Suranjali on this point that, it's actually not about Vodafone and Cain. That's, in my view, that's not the right way to frame the debate. It's not about any specific tax, litigant or investor. It is about the rule of law. I'm all for equity, and I completely agree that the government has to impose taxes because, as we often hear, that one of the reasons why fuel taxes have gone up is because corporate taxes have come down. So government has to make up for that revenue, and therefore they have increased the taxes on fuel. So the government needs revenue to operate. I mean, that's very well settled. But if what was India's concern? If the concern was that an offshore transaction of the kind that Vodafone and Cain Energy indulged in should be taxed, well, then change the law, but change it prospectively. No one is saying that you should not change the law. But when you change the law retroactively, and that too overturning the decision of your own Supreme Court, with the clear intent to target one specific company, I mean, that smacks of bad faith in my view. And that is not something which a liberal democracy like India should be doing. That was a horrible mistake that the past government made. The new government, it's not a new government anymore, but yeah, this government has corrected it, but it took 7 years for it to correct this mistake. It could have easily done it, and it just required, and they have the political capital, they have a huge majority. They could have easily done it, and if not they, then who? Because generally it is said that these economic reform measures require a lot of political capital, and this government has that political capital. So I'm not against the tax amendment per se, but I'm against the application of the law retroactively. To answer your question, Ashrita, on going forward, well, speaking as a lawyer, I can say that if India is very touchy about its taxation measures being adjudicated by arbitration tribunals, then what India has done in its model BIT is the way forward, that you specifically mention that taxation measures are outside the purview of the Investment Treaty Arbitration Tribunal. But it is also important for us to understand that even if you have not excluded taxation measures specifically, investment treaty arbitration tribunals will grant significant deference to the country's taxation measures, as it is clearly evident in the jurisprudence that we have. The investment treaty arbitration tribunals step in only when there are cases of confiscatory taxation or abusive taxation or taxation being imposed which is discriminatory, so on and so forth. If you are adopting a genuine taxation policy, taxation measure, even if it causes economic loss to the investor, the tribunal will not interfere and say that this is inconsistent with the country's investment treaty obligations. Likewise, even if you exclude taxation measures completely from the purview of the BIT, as the UCOS arbitration tribunal tells us, if the taxation measure is abusive, or if it is discriminatory, or if it is confiscatory, then the arbitration tribunal can still adjudicate upon such taxation measures. So, more important than excluding taxation measures from the purview of the investment treaty, what is important is that you enact taxation measures in good faith, which is proportionate, bona fide. And if you do so, I do not think that the arbitration tribunal will find fault with such a taxation policy. So I guess it's more about good governance and good regulatory practices than about fixing the treaty language. That can also be done, but more important than fixing treaty language is good governance and good regulatory practice.
So I'd like to bring Suranjali and Pratibha in for this. What do we see as the future now from a tax treaty dispute resolution framework perspective? Or if you want to make comments more broadly on just tax treaties and the way forward, that should be fine because we're almost towards the end of the session. Suranjali, you could start and then Pratibha could follow.
Yeah, Ashita, I want to make a couple of concluding comments and they'll be super quick, I promise. I think when we talk about retroactive legislation, we look at India as an isolated case. But if you look back at the UK cases as well, the Finance Act in 2008 was amended for one particular transaction through Isle of Man. And then for exclusions, which the new BIT model does. In fact, the UN suggests that you could make exclusions even for shell companies using BIT as a process to resolve disputes. And these exclusions can work out in the future. But I think what is at tension now is that in the global tax conversations, we are looking at a tax certainty process, which is binding on countries. And in some sense, it seems that there is a two-faced approach. One is to say that large multinational corporations with more than $20 billion of revenue will have a new system of dispute resolution, which is quick, prompt, and may not even involve the Revenue Authority in India. Whereas for all other matters, we say tax sovereignty matters. So I think going forward, that's another big question that will confront the tax department and for general thinking about dispute resolution. Thanks, Ashita.
Thank you, Suranjali. Pratibha, I'd wait to hear your reflections and then we have one audience question as well. Yeah.
I think, in the Vodafone judgment itself, about 10 years ago, it's trying to find that relevant quote. But if I remember correctly, the Supreme Court itself had said certainty and stability form the basic foundations of any fiscal system. Tax policy certainty is crucial for taxpayers, including foreign investors, to make rational economic choices in most efficient manner. That's the crux of it, as far as I'm concerned. I have no problem. I probably pay more taxes than I should. I have no problem with paying taxes. I don't think foreign investors have any problem with paying taxes as long as they know what that is before doing a transaction, so they can factor that in. The basic purpose of doing business is to make money. We can't deny that. And it is the right to do commerce, and it is the right to have that visibility. And this is true for domestic, foreign investors, domestic citizens, everybody, right? We need to know, and we need to be able to plan out what we are doing vis-a-vis the tax that is applicable to us. Imagine today if we didn't know at the end of the year what tax we are going to pay. How are you going to plan your budget for yourself personally? Same is applicable to the foreign investors. So tax certainty, you cannot say the sovereignty of the company overrides the tax certainty that you need to provide its citizens and its investors. I agree with Professor Anjan that goes against the basic tenet of taxation norms and international taxation. I think what has been happening in India is tax terrorism. The amount of money that goes in disputes, both domestic investors and foreign investors, that just sits there till a decade, 2 decades, you get the judgment in your favor by the Supreme Court, and then you get the money back, and then they also have to pay penal interest, which they don't account for in their budget. Is nothing else. It's a very narrow approach to how you should be looking at taxation. I don't think any country that we should be comparing ourselves to operates the way we operate. And that's where we are getting hurt. I'll stop at that.
Okay, I have 2 questions from the audience. One's addressed to Suranjali and one is more general. So we'll take the specific one and also I'll read out the general one so everyone can comment in the last. We have about 7 minutes to go. So Suranjali, do you know of any comparative study across countries that measures the impact of international tax treaties on investment and growth? Any particular study that you may recall?
In fact, there are very many. You can literally just Google search it and you'll find. I think the gold standard in this is the study by Demuish, who is now sort of associated with the IMF. And they look at, it's a meta-analysis which looks at the relationship across jurisdictions. So that might be an interesting. In fact, there are studies which even look at the relationship between investment and investment treaties. So way too many studies for me to quote in my 2 minutes.
Thank you. And just to recap the name, she's referring to Ruud D. Muji. For those of you who are interested, you can Google and the study is easily accessible. But now the larger question to everybody again. We have stoked quite a lot of interest on the retro tax controversy, as I see from the question. So the question is the motivation for such mistakes derived from a desire to boost tax revenues, or is the idea to make an example of companies who go out of their way to avoid paying tax? Of course, what is avoidance is also a question all of us tax lawyers may really have a whole session to debate about. So maybe we have 5 minutes to go. So last words, we start with Prabhash, Pratibha, and then Suranjali.
I think it's both. It's both the desire to boost tax revenue and also make an example of companies who go out of the way to avoid paying tax. The political economy of the retroactive tax amendment is very interesting. You should read the work of Sanjay Baru and several other people, including the recent book of Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And there's a lot that happened behind the scenes on who was the chief architect of the retroactive amendment and how there was disagreement even within the government, and perhaps the then prime minister was not on board, and yet it was sort of pushed through the parliament. So that in itself tells you a story about how this whole thing was brought in. The other concluding point I want to make is that, I mentioned earlier about excluding taxation measures from the purview of investment treaties. But even if you do that, I do not foresee in the future investors not using ISDS in the investment treaties to still challenge taxation measures. Because, as the Energy Charter Treaty jurisprudence tells us, the investors can still challenge a regulatory measure saying that this is not a tax measure, whereas the state would argue that what we have enacted or what we have adopted is a tax measure. And then the arbitration tribunal will adjudicate to decide whether indeed this is a tax measure or this is not a tax measure. This was in fact a case, this was also an example in the Nissan case, where the argument was that whether what the Tamil Nadu government did, was it part of taxation or was it not part of taxation? Because, just because you impose a levy or a fee or anything of that sort, that will not make it a taxation measure. There are certain attributes of a taxation measure. So even if you exclude taxation measure, foreign investors will still try to challenge this is not a taxation measure. The flip side of excluding taxation measures completely from the purview of BIT is that there is a possibility of abuse by the state. The state may enact several kinds of regulatory measures and put it under the garb of taxation just to exclude liability from the investment treaty. So this normative dialogue, as Julian Chase and others have called, between international tax law and international investment law will continue in the foreseeable future. So the work of tax lawyers and investment lawyers is sorted, at least for the foreseeable future. Thank you.
Good to know that our careers are secure. Over to you, Karan.
I actually am not going to try and determine what their intent was. Whatever their intent was, it's the outcome that worries me. And I am glad that the broader policy level machinery recognizes the impact that this can have. I know for sure that every time that our representatives go abroad for investment discussions, these issues come up. So it's a decade of seeing the impact. It's not knee-jerk reaction by the authorities. It's very thought through, thankfully, and welcome. So yeah, for me the outcome is more important.
Thank you, Suranjali, please.
Yeah, Ashita, I think the question is actually quite relevant. It goes back to the Shom Committee report, wherein the retroactive measure was to be evaluated against 3-4 metrics. And what is specifically said that any measure should not be an attempt to expand the tax base. But while reading this, I keep thinking that if you're fixing a legal infirmity, you're definitely going to expand the tax base. And so to disentangle those becomes really, really difficult. There are tests that are developed even in other countries, I think like Germany and Netherlands, where the legislature has to expand on why they're sort of undertaking that measure. And I think what was the problem in implementing this was the way it was communicated. If you have someone saying that this is specifically designed to target X, Y, or Z, the intent is completely lost, even if it is well-meaning. So I think the communication was rather poor. And just to sort of end this by saying what will happen in the future, agree with Prabhash. Now, if you even look at the 500-page arbitration award for Kane, there is this nice little distinction drawn to say this is a tax-related investment dispute. And so long as we allow for the creation of a new category, disputes can continue in the future, even if we make, let's say, blanket exclusions, because this may qualify as investment. And the other thing that needs to be thought about carefully is about, whether arbitration tribunals have the expertise to talk about taxation or measures in public interest, because this is something that the arbitration award as well skips around. It doesn't really talk about it in detail, doesn't really admit whether it has the expertise to rule on this, but nevertheless ruled on it. So I think so long as these gray area in international law exist, our research will continue and our debates will continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It does appear that we are at the end of our session. Just a few words to close the session, and then if Ashish wants to come in. I would just like to thank Pratibha, Prabhash, and Suranjali. For those of you listening in, you may have just got a flavor of what tax law is like. We've had people ranging from expertise of law, economics, but law within tax, law within investment and trade law, engaging in a discussion that could go on all day. So hopefully for all the banking and finance students listening in, we have stoked your interest to also look at tax law, apart from just business and banking law. And I would just like to thank Pratibha, Suranjali, and Prabhash for contributing to the lively, engaging discussion. We may not have all agreed on some points, but I think that's what academic discussions should be like.